One of the very common questions I get is, how do I deal with cultural differences in negotiation? Now, if any of you ever take a negotiation course with me, you know that I don't spend a lot of time on culture. That's not because I think culture is unimportant. In fact, cultural differences are incredibly important in negotiation. But here's something I will say. All too often, culture is used as an excuse for why negotiation fails. So today, I'm going to take on the topic of culture. I'm going to tell you how I think about it, why it matters, why it is sometimes overused as an excuse for negotiation failure, and most importantly, if you stay to the end, you will get some specific tips on how to manage cultural differences in negotiation. So let me start by talking about what do we mean when we say culture in negotiation. My guess is what immediately comes to your mind is national culture. Something like, how do Chinese people negotiate? Or how do South Americans negotiate? And certainly we could think of culture in national terms or regional terms. When I think of culture, I think of something much broader than simply Middle Easterners versus Europeans. Culture really speaks to the environment and the norms and the ways in which we live and operate and make meaning. And so, yes, there are national cultures. I am somebody who has had the opportunity to work in hospitals and in universities and with lawyers and with high school students and in churches and in synagogues and in mosques. And when I go into these environments, you know what I notice? Cultural differences. Because there are distinct cultures, distinct norms in the way lawyers interact versus the way doctors interact versus the way folks in a church might interact. And in fact, my own cultural norms will differ if I am working in my church as opposed to if I am working in a professional environment. So when we talk about culture, what I want to suggest is that all of us represent and embody multiple cultures at the same time. I'm an American who is trained in law, who lives in the Northeast, and am university educated. Each of those bring a different kind of culture. As we think about culture, I want to invite us to think about it in the broadest of terms. And this leads to one of the concerns that I have about the way culture is sometimes treated in negotiation. Because many times I hear people say, well, the reason why that deal failed is we just have cultural differences we couldn't get over. And again, does culture contribute to negotiation? Yes. But I think it's an oversimplification to blame culture. Usually, if we dissect that negotiation, I can identify some things that are not just culturally related that can explain why the negotiation went poorly. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to culture in negotiation. But what it does mean is that we have to have a more complex idea of understanding what we mean by culture, and we have to be wary of over-blaming culture when we have negotiation difficulties. So here are 4 key tips for managing cultural differences in negotiation. And again, when I say cultural, I mean national, I mean regional, I mean professional, I mean organizational. And let me throw one important thing in there. In any negotiation relationship, we are also developing a very specific culture of 2. In fact, if you look at the way I interact with, let's say, my friend Martin, and then compare it with the way I interact with my friend Allie, I act totally differently. And that is not because I am a different person, but because I know that we have developed a set of different cultural norms and expectations. Martin and I can share jabs and insults and joke with each other in a way that if I did that with Allie, it might be hurtful or upsetting or disruptive of the relationship. And so that leads to my first piece of advice, which is that we need to research relevant cultures before we begin the negotiation. So if I'm going to negotiate with a lawyer in Hong Kong, There are a number of different cultures that are in place. One is lawyering in Hong Kong. The other might be the firm. The other might be understanding what my specific relationship to this person is. The other might be the culture around an area of practice. Secondly, and related to this, right, I need to adjust my style and approach accordingly. To go back to my example with Martin and Allie, I'm not changing who I am adjusting certain stylistic tendencies in a way to help build a very specific and collaborative and genuine culture of two. Or if I'm in a big negotiation, maybe it's a culture of 4 or 6 or 8. Third, if I am going to be in a longer negotiation with folks who are coming from many different cultural backgrounds, I want to think about, is there some possibility that we as a group can spend some time adopting a shared or new culture? So one way of thinking about this is when we're negotiating the process, we might talk about certain shared norms and expectations, certain behavioral expectations about how we will work. Let me give you at least 2 examples. One is if we think about international bodies like the World Trade Organization in Geneva or the United Nations. These bodies bring people together from all sorts of national cultures. But over time, they have developed protocols about how they interact with each other, what kind of behaviors are accepted and not. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't national cultural differences showing up in these organizations. Of course, there are. So if I'm operating in the World Trade Organization, one of the advantages that a trained diplomat has is that they bring to the table an understanding of a shared diplomatic protocol about how to communicate and how to get things done. A second example of negotiating a shared culture. Oftentimes when I'm working with a group, either as a mediator or as a facilitator, trying to help them come to some kind of shared resolution, I begin that interaction by proposing a set of shared norms and guidelines. Sometimes groups find that strange. They'll be like, wait a minute, like we've worked with each other, like why are we doing this? But what I'm trying to do is say, in the context of this negotiation, we're going to operate with a certain set of understandings or rules about how we will interact with each other. And so this can be an incredibly helpful way to bridge a cultural gap. The last important point, and I think this is really circling back to one of my themes earlier, is that as much as culture is important in negotiation, it's incredibly important as well to avoid stereotyping and broad generalizations. So I always get a bit of an allergic reaction when someone says something like, this is how the Japanese negotiate, or everybody from this organization acts in X, Y, and Z. Stereotyping and broad generalizations can really get us in trouble in negotiation. So to recap the advice on dealing with culture in negotiation, first, I want to research the relevant cultures that might be in play here. Yes, this person might come from India, but there's probably a whole bunch of other relevant cultures that are playing into how they might behave, and I need to think about that. Second, I want to adjust my style and approach accordingly. It does mean working really hard to create a culture of two that could sustain mutual gains and cooperation. Third, particularly when working with groups that might represent many different cultures, think about whether there is a way that for the purpose of the negotiation, you can adopt or create a shared culture for that group. And lastly, as much as culture matters, avoid stereotyping and making broad generalizations. So to continue your learning and negotiation, please keep watching this next video, which is how do I negotiate when the other side has more power. Also, it is a cultural norm that if you are still watching at this point, you will do the following 3 things. You will like this video, you will ring the bell to get notified when I drop more videos, and you will subscribe. Also, one more cultural suggestion, please share my channel with friends of yours. I'd love to get some more viewers. Okay, keep on watching. Okay, you know you want to binge my channel.